All right, so the recording has started. I'm going to just go over one more time some of our housekeeping rules. My name is Maureen Dadabhoy. I'm here from OCHR. And so you know, our speakers will be speaking for about 5 to 10, maybe 12 minutes. If you have any questions at all as we're doing the presentations, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Bill and I will be addressing those later. With that, what I'd like to do is go ahead and introduce Ali Edwards, CEO of OCHR, and Bill Maurer from UCI to do our welcome address and the land acknowledgement. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Maureen. It's so nice to be here with all of you. My name is Ali Edwards. I am the CEO of OC Human Relations, as Maureen shared, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you, UCI, for this continued partnership that we have. And it's so nice to be here with so many esteemed colleagues today. It's important to address topics like this. And I have to tell you, certainly I didn't grow up thinking I'd be doing the welcome for panels on extremism. Doesn't seem like something anyone really wants to address, but it's important work. And one of the reasons that we endeavor into this type of conversation is because we can change the narrative about these issues. For many years, it's been easy to think of hate activity and hate motivated behavior as something that happens in the fringes. And when we do that, we can just sort of write it off as like, oh, that just happens once in a while. It's not a big deal. Those are just those people. But it's important for those of us who are in the business of fighting and preventing hate to make sure that we understand that another way to view this type of behavior is that it might be reflective of the challenges that we have in our culture. And if that's true, it also means that we as creators and keepers of culture have impact, have influence, have agency to prevent hate and to fight hate. So today, I hope that even though we're talking about terms like extremism, I hope that you'll leave here feeling like you can see a pathway to be effective in preventing and fighting hate, and that we can continue to change that narrative to one that empowers us all to take action instead of thinking of this as solely fringe behavior that we don't have to pay attention to. So knowing many of the people on this panel today, I'm sure that you will have that type of experience. These are incredible and knowledgeable folks that have a lot to offer. So with that, I am going to thank you one more time all for being here and to all our great panelists, and I will pass it over to Bill.
Well, thank you so much, Ali, and thanks, Maureen. It's wonderful to have this partnership between UCI and OCHR and to be addressing this important topic with so many experts today. You know, it's really striking to me that anti-Semitism is one of the most ancient forms of hate, and yet increasingly in our recent memory being promulgated and amplified by some of the most advanced technologies. And so I'm just really grateful for everyone who's going to be speaking here today to share their insight and also to move us towards some of those solutions and ways that we can address this problem and empower ourselves and others, as Ali said. This event is sponsored by OC Human Relations, and I just want to, and School of Social Sciences at UCI, and I just want to briefly put up the list of our roster of speakers, and this is the order in which people will proceed. We'll start with a team from the ADL, followed by Professor Jonathan Ong, Professor Pete Simi, Professor Rebekah Tromble, and then following up at the end by Michael Brown from Homeland Security, after which we'll have moderated Q&A. So again, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. If you run into any sort of technical issues, you can jot that down there too, and one of us will try to address it. But without further ado, I will hand it off to Peter Levy and the folks from the ADL to kick off our conversation. And again, thank you all so much.
Well, good morning, and it's a delight to be with you all. I am Peter Levy. I'm the regional director for the ADL office in Orange County and Long Beach. And I'm just going to share a few introductory words so before you can then go ahead and hear from our experts about the role that ADL plays, particularly in how we fight extremism on the ground here, particularly when individuals are targeted. ADL is just like OC Human Relations is a reporting agency. When people are targeted by bias, bigotry, and hate, not only should it be reported to law enforcement, we ask also that you report it to organizations like ADL, because what we do is we provide assistance and services to help resolve situations for individuals or organizations when they're targeted. In fact, right before the call with the panelists, we were discussing how this forum last year was Zoom bombed by neo-Nazis, and it was reported to ADL, which is really important. A couple of reasons. One, reporting creates data, and data is how we drive policy. So reporting is really important. We can't fight hate and extremism if we don't know where and when it's happening. So that's a really important part about reporting. B, ADL, particularly through our Center for Technology and Society, and you'll be hearing about some of those folks from some of those folks shortly, has relationships with many of the platforms and the tech companies. So ADL has been instrumental going back to the very early days of the pandemic of actually working with Zoom in order to create the appropriate security measures in order to prevent the extremist incursions on online platforms, particularly in Zoom meetings, which has been highly disruptive. So, ADL plays this role. We help not only private industry develop and change their policies in order to stem hate and extremism. We also provide that service, for individuals. And in that aspect, I want to just share, a big win that we had last year. In California, ADL led a coalition of over 90 organizations to support AB 587, which is the Social Media Transparency Bill, which was signed into law in September by the governor. This law requires social media platforms to publicly disclose their community safety guidelines and report data around hate, harassment, misinformation, disinformation, foreign interference, and enforcement of their own policies. One of the things we've learned is that many of the social media platforms have obscured their data. They collect it, they know it, but they don't want it made publicly available to civil society, to academics, to researchers to understand hate and extremism and the proliferation online, because A, it makes them look bad. B, and then it hurts their profits and their bottom line. So we led a campaign of putting people over profits and for a social media transparency, which doesn't mandate them what they could do, but simply requires them to report to the California Attorney General's office each year how well they're doing, what their statistics are on fighting hate and extremism rather than obscuring it, so that, once again, civil society and academics and researchers, like the great experts on this call, can then study and understand hate and extremism, so then we could do something to create the world that we want our children and grandchildren to grow up in, that we can create safe online spaces. Because right now, the volume of hate and harassment that happens online actually curbs people's behavior, which is problematic, right? Because all the benefits are sometimes lost. People curb the behavior to avoid the hate and harassment. Now, just a few comments before I pass it on what's happening on the ground. In 2022, locally, our ADL office received more complaints than we had ever received since we've been taking incident responses from the public, and so many of those were involved in sort of online harassment and hate and extremism. So the distinction between online and offline is really blurred and non-existent anymore, right? Online harms are real harms, right? Our lives today, and we've learned, kids in schools and workplaces, we don't make a distinction between our on and offline lives, that it's really integrated. So the type of harassment and hate and extremism that's experienced in any of those spaces has to be taken with, sort of very much equal weight. That being said, when we see offline activity like banner drops over freeways, flyering, of which we've had hundreds and hundreds of homes receive extremist flyers here in Orange County, stickers, and trolling online, what we see is that a lot of extremist groups are exploiting whatever they can in order to drive people to their online networks. And because this is where the reach happens. They do the reach on and offline, but what they will do is want to reach as many people as they can, because that's where the recruitment happens. Recruit people into their ideology. So what might sound as patriotic, red, white, and blue America, know your heritage, is really a doorway often into white supremacy, white nationalism, extremist ideas that are highly xenophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, and anti-gay, lesbian, bi, trans, and queer. And they access any of those vehicles as a doorway to really continue to recruit folks. So once they get the reach, then the recruitment starts through the rabbit holes in these online spaces with invitations into sort of the more unsavory platforms and cesspools of just hate where it's normalized. And then, right, that's where radicalization happens to encourage people to do more actions. And particularly recently, we've seen this past school year, for example, we've seen online extremists and organizations actually creating high school student online clubs to recruit high school students, right? This is where, unfortunately, we see much of the recruitment happening in these teen years. As we've seen, violent extremists, right? If we look at some of the horrific murders over the past few years, these are often people who are 19, 20, 21, and we know the recruitment happened when they were younger teens, right? In middle school and high school. Right? This is a particular area of concern and danger. Particularly of the massive incursion in online gaming that we see of extremists, even down to that middle school level age, whether or not it's Roblox or Minecraft. So the landscape online is a wonderful place to be, to connect. It's an essential part of our lives, but we have to understand it. Laws like the Social Media Transparency Bill in California should get some transparency so we can understand it, which is really important. The public's reporting is really important because that creates data, and data is how we drive policy, whether or not it's working with companies like Zoom, which we've successfully done, or the legislator, like we've successfully done, right? This is how we move the needle and create a better world where we could stem hate and extremism. And please, just Google ADL Orange County if you ever need to reach ADL, or ADL report an incident if you want to report anything. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, Peter. I think I'm going to take that as my cue and jump in. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Bill and to Maureen for organizing this. For Peter for being able to join us as well. I'm Jordan Kramer. I'm Director of Research at ADL's Center for Technology and Society. And I'm going to share my screen for a moment, so please bear with me. Hopefully you can see that now. I'm especially glad to be here and to be presenting at UC Irvine and for OC Human Relations, because I, along with my, or sort of before my work at ADL, I completed my PhD in cultural anthropology at Irvine. with Tom Belsdorf, and got to work with Bill, and where I studied social media practices in Berlin. And so this was a really strong foundation for the kind of research that I lead now at ADL. And I will be touching on some of the things that Peter said as well, because the kind of legislative efforts that we've been successful with and our advocacy campaigns are very much driven by our research. So actually, yeah. So at CTS, we do a lot of different kinds of work. We do surveys, we do qualitative studies, we do database and sort of quantitative database investigations, social media scraping, and my colleague Stevie Ray, who will be sharing this part of the presentation with me, is responsible for a lot of that really excellent work that we do. But I just want to step back and sort of provide the big picture. What are we talking about when we talk about hate and harassment online? How do we study this topic? And then what do we do with it? So for us, when we talk about online harassment, we're talking about unwanted, often hostile contact across social media platforms, but it could also be email, chat, in games, anywhere that people are congregating online. And harassment includes everything from verbal abuse to hate speech to trolling to cyber stalking. It can take place through memes and images. It can even be through spamming, denial of service, impersonation is something we actually see more than you might think. And then we're particularly concerned with things like sustained harassment campaigns, doxing, which is exposing personal information, often for further harassment, and swatting, which is also sort of one of the most severe forms of abuse, a false police call to get law enforcement to show up at someone's home. And we consider the ones I just described to be severe abuse. But we're not just concerned with harassment online. Obviously, that's a pretty big topic. But at ADL, as a civil rights organization, we are especially concerned with how harassment targets people based on their identity, and typically their identity in marginalized groups or targeted groups. And so for us, when we talk about identity-based harassment, we see that as a form of hate. So, as I said, we have a whole number of different kinds of approaches that we take to studying hate and harassment online, and to trying to evaluate policy recommendations. We work pretty closely with platforms, both behind the scenes to, often cooperatively, but we also push on them and push forward legislation and regulation when they don't respond to cooperation. So we particularly focus on the experiences of targets of hate and harassment, and we focus on how product design and also platform policies make harassment easier, don't adequately stop it, and so forth. So one of our signature reports is our annual nationally representative survey, the online hate and harassment survey. So we conduct this every year since 2018. And we have been finding that overall harassment online is holding steady. And this is despite social media platforms often very visible, very high profile efforts to curb it. But the thing that really concerns me is looking at how trends within it. So for example, severe harassment among Asian American respondents spiked in 2021, and then total harassment among Asian Americans spiked again. Spiked in 2022, 39% compared to 21% the year before. And we also see that some groups, and not surprisingly, groups are historically and socially marginalized, are targeted the most. So LGBTQ plus respondents receive 66% experience some form of harassment online. That's a lot great, and that's compared to 33% of folks who are not LGBTQ plus. And I just got 2 more slides, then I'm going to pass it to you, Stevie. So one other big question is, where does harassment happen? Well, we know it happens on Facebook. It happens all over, but we know it happens most often on Facebook, even though we don't necessarily see it. As researchers, it's harder to sort of see where it happens on Facebook. And we've tried to control for, is it just happening on Facebook because that's the most popular platform? So for example, you can see, TikTok, there's more harassment on TikTok this past year than 2 years ago because TikTok's getting more popular. But no, it turns out when we contrast how often people say they use a platform and how likely they are to be harassed there, Facebook wins the day. This is a ratio here of 81%, of 68% of people experienced harassment and 84% of people use Facebook regularly. As opposed to YouTube, where a lot of people use YouTube, but they're actually not as likely to be harassed there. You can see Instagram, Twitter are similar likelihood of being harassed. And interestingly, the sort of fringe platforms, we actually see less harassment, but partly that's because people aren't necessarily harassing other people there. That's where they're coordinating harassment of others. All right, I am passing it off to you, Stevie. Do you want me to just keep going, or do you want me to stop? All right, I'm going to stop and let you share.
Yeah, I'll share. All
right.
The same. Thank you, Jordan, and hello, everyone. And it is great to be back in Orange County virtually. Like Jordan, I too got my PhD in cultural anthropology from UC Irvine a few years ago. The data that Jordan is talking about are really, really helpful. They really only show us part of the picture. There's a really common misconception that we find when people talk about online harassment, in that, and this includes platforms, in that it's understood to be explicit and directed. That really misses the point about how harassment works. In many, many cases, especially when considering the role of influential accounts like those verified accounts, big time celebrities and politicians and influential figures. Wrote this post last year. You can find it on ADL's website if you're interested. Influential accounts don't need to be directly engaged in hate and harassment in order to cause harm. Instead, they attract followers who interpret their dog whistles and other kind of implicit directions to incite them to go out and harass others. It's kind of what we call stochastic harassment, jumping off of a phrase you may have heard, stochastic terrorism, kind of floating around these days. And in the piece we wrote, we made this point about Twitter, but it really applies to a lot of other social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, to name just a few. To make matters worse, social media platforms' policies are written such that they can't really account for this reality. They treat individual accounts in isolation for the most part. And even when they do consider an account's historical, involvement in harassment, typically it's a secondary concern in their decision about whether to take action against that account and the content that they are putting out there. As Jordan mentioned, also harassment is usually networked. It's often coordinated on a fringe platform like Gab, like 8kun, like Truth Social, different from the one where harassment is experienced by the targets of that harassment. Individuals, of course, can be targeted across multiple platforms as well. So when we're considering the full scope of online hate and harassment, it gets very complicated very quickly, and we need to take a broad view of the entire ecosystem. Here's an example from research that Jordan did a few years ago about harassment being coordinated on 4chan, directed at a target on Twitch. And as you can see, spelling, not a strong point among these folks, but effective nonetheless in targeting this Twitch account. Nowadays we often hear arguments in public discourse about how content moderation, that flagging and reporting and taking down content, that's anti-free speech, right? That these platforms, they have to let people express themselves freely, even if we disagree with the content. their expression. And in theory, that's great, right? We all, I think, here agree, you know, in the fundamental right that everyone has to express themselves and to speak freely. However, allowing hate and harassment to go unchecked on social media platforms actually works against free speech. And this is an important argument that I think gets missed sometimes. Harassment silences the targets of that harassment by pushing them off the platform, by making it unsafe for them to participate in these spaces. That there are actual world effects, as Peter mentioned in his intro, right? Like online hate and harassment never stays online. It has offline spillover effects to communities, emotional and psychological distress, and reputational harm, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, and maybe we can get into this in Q&A, CTS, we're beginning a long-term project, an ethnographic project about online hate and harassment targeting local communities, which we're really excited about. So what are we seeing kind of recently? There was a lot of kind of attention given to Twitter back in October and November after Elon Musk acquired the platform. People started to report and to see a giant spike in types of in the like prevalence of hate content. And of course, we at the ADL have an interest in focusing on anti-Semitic content. It's not the only kind of content that was that spiked during that period, but it is an important thing to pay attention to. As Bill mentioned in his intro, it's one of the most historical kind of examples of hate and harassment, and it's often been a leading indicator of a rise in extremism. And as Peter noted, OCADL got more reports about anti-Semitic incidents in this past year than in previous ones. We are seeing that across the board, a rise in anti-Semitism. So we saw this also on Twitter. Our colleagues at the Center on Extremism noted this rise, a spike in anti-Jewish sentiments post takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk. This kind of reflects what a few other research organizations, civil society and academic research organizations were also seeing. We at CTS have what is called a trusted flagger account with Twitter, which allows us to escalate abuse reports directly to their trust and safety routine, or what remains of it. And to be fair, post-Musk Twitter has taken action to remove some really egregious content, but their enforcement has been very inconsistent. As you can see, the majority of things that we reported to them in this spike period, they did not take any action on. And this has remained pretty consistent over the next few months as we continue to, we're doing this even today. So it's better than nothing, right? But it really reflects kind of this lack of understanding about how hate and harassment works on platforms by a platform like Twitter. And I'll just end on this note. Complicating things for us here at CTS and our research colleagues in civil society and academia, and as Peter also noted already, platforms are really making it difficult for us to access data about hate and harassment, specifically via what are called application programming interfaces, or APIs. APIs are one of the most useful tools that our research center uses, our colleagues in other organizations, our colleagues in academia use for getting a sense of what is the activity happening on a social media platform. And as Axel Bruns at Queensland University has noted, we are living in what he calls a API-calypse, a rollback that many social media platforms are doing by restricting access to their APIs. partially as a result of scandal, but also partially just because what we find does not make them look good, to be frank. Most recently, just in this past week, Twitter announced that it would be ending free access to its open API that many researchers rely upon, including researchers that on our team. Dr. Kate Starbird up at University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public put it this way, that this could be very well be the end of an era for platforms transparency and social media research. And really, civil society and academic researchers, I think we have a critical role to play in holding big tech accountable. That's one of the things that CTS, that's one of our missions. And things like this make it much more difficult for us to play that role. So I thank you. I look forward to questions and Q&A. And I will pass things over, I think, to our colleague, Dr. Jonathan Ong.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Jordan. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me to this event. I was invited to give a global perspective to our discussion today. And I don't have any slides to present, but I will be reading off of a script here. So thank you once again for this opportunity to connect with you all. My research has focused on the global south, what we provocatively refer to as the majority world. And my region of expertise is Southeast Asia, with a focus on the Philippines and Thailand. And I've been also quite recently collaborating with researchers in Brazil on a cross-country learning project. For those of you who are familiar, obviously the Philippines and Brazil held very important elections in 2022 with different outcomes for democratic movements. And I know my colleague Fran will be sharing with you folks some links to my research, including research on the Philippine elections entitled Parallel Public Spheres, the more recent paper that compares Brazil and the Philippines experience to kind of like normalize a South-to-South learning exchange space to discuss, what can global South countries learn from each other rather than kind of like rely on global North frameworks to explain our political realities. And we hope this is more responsive to on the specific political realities in the global South, and that's one of the first papers out of that project. So I also have research interests investigating Asian American digital politics, which might be of particular interest to those of you here who are interested in what I think are very important parallel and simultaneous operations of digital hate against communities of color on one hand. So it kind of like operates in that way. You have on one hand these communities of color who are targeted by racist and exclusionary discourse and policy, but it's important to also think about the secondary kind of layer of how these groups are also radicalized and recruited to extreme far-right perspectives. And I think this work that I collaborated with other researchers in the Asian American Disinformation Roundtable might be of interest to you folks to really understand how communities of color are on one hand targets of hate and harassment, but also addressed as important constituencies to grow a multiracial right-wing coalition. And I think that that parallel and movement is important to really unpack and understand. Obviously, it's important to also deepen our understanding of the international dimension and transnational flows of these narratives and movements. How underlying sentiments of fear-mongering, populist anxiety, and attack of democratic values and institutions are happening in various contexts to varying degrees, but also sharing similar playbooks. In the diaspora, I think it's helpful to think through how diasporic communities um, help shed light in terms of what happens when these communities, on one hand, are expose and look back at their home countries and how their home countries embrace charismatic populist presidents, while at the same time experience within their host countries the mainstreaming of far-right ideology. So I guess I want to highlight here and what I want to amplify what Ali Edwards in her introduction said about how, extremist views are becoming more and more mainstream. And I think many of these communities in the margins of conversation are really the best kind of communities to help us think through how these processes actually happen and the different paradoxes and challenges in terms of also responding to them. So, as a researcher, I've been thinking more carefully how we can develop more expansive research paradigms and frameworks that are committed to really unpacking how should we engage with citizens, with ordinary people. How do we engage with them? Those who supported anti-democratic principles and leaders and political parties, right? So, this is a huge and open question for many of my collaborators and community partners in the Philippines, which is where I'm from, and I do most of my applied research. And over the past year, we held an important elections in 2022, where we elected the son of a former dictator into the presidency. And Ferdinand Marcos Jr. follows Rodrigo Duterte, a populist president who normalized a lot of these in his political speech, normalized profanity, misogyny, also amplified anti-US sentiments and also anti-human rights sentiments in his speech. And we're observing, under Marcos, whom he is allied with, are these sentiments increasingly consolidated. And we saw at least the outcome of that election where over 65% voted for Marcos. This having to be confronted with this political reality that citizens are embracing leaders who are advancing these kinds of principles. And so the discussions among us researchers, civil society advocates, journalists, human rights workers on the ground, what do we do now? Do we shun these people, these supporters? Do we cancel celebrities and businesses who are pro-Marcos? Do we campaign for them to be deplatformed off of Facebook and social media platforms? How do we assign blame to platforms for perhaps expanding, normalizing anti-democratic sentiments and political parties and their values? Is it politically useful to advance a kind of technological determinism to, assign blame to them for how this has been normalized? Or is that too polarizing, right? To say that Facebook expanded anti-democratic values, perhaps it's more relevant or useful to advance more anthropological and historical explanatory frameworks to perhaps discuss and pay attention to socio-cultural factors, that might explain in longer terms why people are attracted to these leaders who normalize anti-democratic sentiments. And I think this is where our community finds itself in. Is it about finding the right balance? Is it about, being contextual, how we leverage, tools of cancel culture to assign accountability? Is this a desperation move that we are currently in at the moment, or is there value in the long-term work of building spaces in the middle? And I think those are very profound questions that we are working through at the moment. And I think I just want to kind of like wrap up some of my own critical position in this space. So my own research examines how exactly social media platforms and online networks are responsible, complicit, and also amplifying some of these sentiments. And my own research also challenges a lot of mainstream explanatory frames that are quite reductive in my view. So I also challenge the technology first explanations that talk about, digital populism and overly focus on the digital aspect of it. There's ways of explaining, this current moment in the Philippines and most of the global South as this is about top-down state architectures, that it's a top-down coordination of state actors enlisting paid political trolls to legitimize their positions. My own research involved interviews with influencers and fake account operators enlisted in campaigns. And what I found was that these architectures are more horizontal, they're more participatory in their approach. My discovery is that political trolling is not a full-time job. To be a troll is not a full-time work. It's a side hustle. It's a gig folded within creative industries rather than existing in a dark web. And so it's important to think about the structural and systemic approaches to understanding some of these things. Another, and I'll try to end with this explanatory frame that I want to challenge is there's a certain kind of anti-poor sentiment that is sometimes expressed in this technology first explanations around, how social media might have brainwashed the masses to vote a certain way. And I find that really deeply entrenching existing social class divides within global South countries. Expressions that Filipinos have lost free will because of Facebook and the manipulation of social media platforms. To me, a lot of this is moral panics driven, and that's why I want to kind of invite you folks to check out one of the interventions that I am in a collaboration with journalist groups to do a troll whistleblower podcast called Catch Me If You Can, where we invite a paid troll worker to tell us about how they got into their kind of work. And here we go beyond neat heroes versus villains narratives to discuss issues of complicity and moral justification. So I hope you check that out. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. And thank you to Bill and Maureen for organizing this event. My name is Pete Simi. I'm a professor of sociology at Chapman University. I was asked to kind of bring the comments focusing here on Southern California. And so I'm going to be discussing one aspect of this issue as it relates to Southern California, referred to as active clubs. See if I can get my screen share here. Okay, great. Yeah, I've been working in this space for over 25 years in terms of looking at issues related to violence, extremism, hate, and particularly focusing on far-right extremism. I tend to approach it from an ethnographic perspective, and so I do want to use some images that are relevant to the topic and in a very short video towards the end. And I'll give you a warning, the video is not particularly graphic, but it is certainly an offensive video, and so I will give you another warning before I play that. I do, as part of my work, spend a lot of time on kind of the darkest corners of the web. Last year, I testified as an expert witness for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York on a terrorism case that involved the now thankfully defunct Telegram channel that was known as Rape Waffen. For those of you not familiar with the platform Telegram, it's organized according to channels, and people are able to view channels across a number of different interests and so forth, but certainly white supremacists have quite a presence on that platform. and have for some time now. The Rape Waffen channel was inspired by the white supremacist terror cell known as Adam Waffen, which continues to pose problems in terms of the threat landscape related to terrorism here in the US and abroad. By the name alone, you can imagine the type of content that was included on that channel. As part of my ongoing efforts to monitor platforms like Telegram, I recently came across a white supremacist incel channel that an incel referring to involuntarily celibate. It was a channel that had some of the most vile messages and images imaginable, so much so that in several cases, the images were so violent and realistic that I immediately turned them over to colleagues at the FBI. One of those videos depicted a woman who was quite literally being barbecued. She had a high-powered rifle of some kind forced into her mouth and was bound while being held over a fire pit. I truly hope that was staged and depicted someone's warped fantasy and was not a grim reality, but in either case, clearly the level of depravity is painfully clear. And all of that type of material is just a few clicks away for anyone with an internet connection. Now, today I want to talk to you about something that's a little different, but only to a degree, really. My comments today are focused on, as I mentioned before, what's become known as active clubs. And that, sounds like a seemingly innocuous term, evoking images of neighborhood youth sports teams. The active clubs I'm going to describe today are important for at least 3 reasons. They represent a more coded effort than some segments of white supremacist extremism. And in turn, they may have a greater capacity to appeal to a larger segment of the white population, especially teens and young men. Of course, you can imagine the mantra of folks just getting together and working out, saying things like, well, what's wrong with a bunch of white guys getting together and working out? And so that becomes in a way a kind of built-in defense mechanism for them to represent themselves. Secondly, they demonstrate a relatively sophisticated capacity to produce influence appeals with contemporary style, imagery, and music, all of which is used to generate large amounts of propaganda. And in many respects, this is about crafting narratives and developing adherents, not so much members. For far too long, I think we've focused too much on the idea of memberships, and what we're really dealing with in many respects, especially as we have more and more moved into this digital realm, we are talking about narratives and adherents that circulate, in some cases, quite broadly and widely. And then thirdly, active clubs represent the long-standing nexus between on and offline landscapes. And as Peter started us off, really talking about the extent to which these are more and more integrated, and it's harder and harder to really think about these as distinct. And they certainly reinforce each other, and active clubs provide an opportunity to think about some of these issues as it relates to a broader infrastructure of white supremacy that unfortunately is quite extensive in the US and abroad. So what is an active club? In short, it involves a group of relatively young white males who join together for athletic training related to mixed martial arts primarily. It's focused on essentially the following 3 themes: nationalism, white identity, and masculinity. They promote a healthy kind of lifestyle, oftentimes focusing on issues as it relates to being drug-free. Of course, physical fitness, obviously, and then in kind of a main part of their outlook is the idea of rejecting the corruption, or what they see as the corruption, weakness, and femininity of the so-called postmodern age, asserting a return to a tribal pre-modern collective as a way to cope with what they describe as a profound sense of alienation associated with contemporary society. Now, where did active clubs come from? In many respects, they start right here in Southern California, in part because of a group known as RAM, the Rise Above movement, which was founded around 2016 primarily by Rob Rundo and Ben Daly, who essentially served as kind of the co-founders. And this was a group that was active here in Southern California, Orange County, LA County. Rundo had grown up in New York, Long Island area, had been involved in a more of a multicultural type gang on the streets, got into a knife fight, stabbed a member of the MS-13 gang, and went to prison for about 5 years back east. And during that time, he got radicalized into white supremacist extremism, ended up coming out with a death's head tattoo, eventually made his way out to Southern California, was living down in San Clemente, and hooked up with Daly at some point, and they eventually recruited a couple dozen folks, probably at their heights. They were doing this kind of training, the mixed martial arts, boxing, and so forth, but they were also attending public rallies and committing substantial acts of violence, including here in Southern California, Huntington Beach, also up in Berkeley, and then eventually at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Several of their members were in Charlottesville and were some of the folks who committed some of the most egregious assaults and violent acts there, aside from, of course, the car attack that eventually killed Heather Heyer and injured a number of other individuals. The violence that they were involved in eventually led to a federal indictment. It was a two-part federal indictment. It was somewhat unusual in the respect that some of their members were indicted here in the Central District of California, and then other members who were actually at the event in Charlottesville, Virginia, were indicted in the district out there. The indictment in the Virginia district was quite successful. It resulted in pleas on the part of the defendants. They pled guilty. Most were sentenced to some prison sentence. And in California, the indictment was quite unsuccessful. Eventually, the judge threw it out, although it was eventually appealed, and it is now still an active case. But certainly the outcome was not especially favorable for the government. Rundo eventually left the country and is still living overseas in Europe, kind of bouncing around from different countries. I believe there is now a warrant out for his arrest. So, it's kind of unclear what will happen with that. But one thing that is clear is that Rundo has had a substantial amount of influence, both prior to the indictment and since the indictment, and has been very active in promoting a variety of different strategies that come under this realm, but certainly the active clubs that have emerged now across the country has been a big part of his influence. We see these active clubs in more than half the states across the US, including a NorCal active club and a SoCal active club. Both can be found on Telegram. They have their own channels on Telegram. But we also see active clubs in other countries as well, including Canada and various European countries. Domestically, one of the things that's important about the active clubs is that they're part of a larger kind of network structure that includes other groups that are prominent within the white supremacist scene, like Patriot Front, White Lives Matter, which has quite a presence here in Southern California. And then older kind of racist skinhead kind of cultural elements that are still hanging around, Hammerskins and so forth. It's also a global component, as I mentioned, that includes the Russian White Rex company linked to MMA fighting, organizing events, and so forth. Here's one of their events in Southern California, San Diego. It was this summer, past August, kind of a culmination of sorts, you might say, in that brought folks together from all over the country. You see a number of folks here with the kind of beige face covering bandanas. These are Patriot Fronts, so they have the kind of khaki colored hats. These are folks from Patriot Front who had a prominent presence at this event down in San Diego, as did a number of other folks, associated with different active clubs and so forth. They had a day-long series of formal fights with the ring that they had there. And of course, a lot of inner, you might say, networking or what they might say kind of fellowshipping in terms of getting together with like-minded folks and being able to kind of talk about their grievances and really build the in-person kind of relationships in addition to the ones that they already have online. So these kind of events really serve an important purpose in that respect, as far as helping kind of further build the infrastructure. You can see kind of this kind of interorganizational linkages here in this photo, where you have folks at the bottom of the screen from White Lives Matter, and then you have folks from an active club up on top of the tree stump there. So again, just kind of demonstrating their efforts to come together across organizational lines, build these broader networks, and express their views. In this case, you see the banner saying that the media's anti-white narrative is killing white children, which is a very long-standing, prominent kind of theme that you find among white supremacists. This idea of white victimization and the idea that the white race is being replaced or will become extinct in the near future. Here's some leafleting that you see that's quite prominent. And again, here you have Patriot Front, you have the Active Club leaflets. So you get a range of different kinds of propaganda that may come together. And this is actually Active Club in Indiana, which tends to be, has become a pretty active club in the US. And then this is a brief video. I think it's important as we think about these issues to understand, again, from an ethnographic perspective, the narratives. What are the grievances that they're trying to express, how they're communicating them. And I say it's important to do that because we're going to develop counter messaging, if we're going to develop prevention strategies, then we need to have as kind of an in-depth understanding as possible from their perspective, so that we're able to more effectively essentially respond to it. And so I think this video is a pretty kind of illustrative example of the themes that they're expressing in the active clubs and certainly beyond among white supremacists more broadly. And it is specific to California. And again, it's an offensive video. So if you're, don't want to watch, certainly maybe undo the posted in the SoCal Active Club Telegram channel. And, you know, in many respects, make America great again, right? That's the theme. So we should both understand that perspective as it relates to the larger, to active clubs and the larger white supremacist movement, but how it also is ingrained in even broader narratives, including those that elected officials, you know, are running on in terms of campaigns and so forth. So it does, I think that video really underscores some of the things that we're really struggling with in terms of as a society, as it relates to different types of social change, the fears that a certain segment of the white population has in particular about demographic changes and cultural changes. And so again, I think if we're going to respond to those effectively, you have to understand them. And then I'll just end here with, again, another propaganda piece from the SoCal Active Club. In a society that's killed all sense of adventure, the only adventure left is to destroy that society. And so I'll just leave it with the point that active clubs may seem like, well, they're just getting together, engaging in physical fitness. We use this term to refer to certain segment of white supremacists as accelerationists, groups like Atomwaffen, which I mentioned at the beginning, groups that are explicitly committed to paramilitary training and engaging in violent acts of terrorism to essentially collapse society. But as you can see from this quote, I mean, that's certainly a sense of that accelerationism, even with groups like these active clubs that may seem like they're engaged in more innocuous activity, but definitely are part of a larger kind of cultural context that certainly includes strong emphasis on the use of violence to achieve political goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I am Rebekah Tromble. I am the director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics and an associate professor at George Washington University. And I come to this as another researcher, but one who has been focused not just on understanding how these extremist individuals and organizations operate or the extent of extremism and so on, but also thinking about how we can devise interventions and solutions to try to address some of these problems. Before I jump into the questions of, or some of the ideas, some of the research and work that's been done in this area, I do want to take one quick second here to underscore something that Stevie was talking about earlier. I know there are a number of other researchers in the audience who have been deeply impacted, whose work has been deeply impacted by the now promised shutdown, restrictions placed on Twitter's API. It's going to be incredibly difficult for many of us to continue to do the work that we have, understanding hate speech, harassment, extremism online. With that, and the Coalition for Independent Technology Research very recently, in the wake of this announcement, released an open letter that has now over 700 individual and organizational sign-ons, including the ADL, calling for increased attention to this problem. And crucially, and so I've just dropped the link to that letter, it is still open for signatures. But even more importantly, the coalition is organizing mutual aid to support those especially under-resourced organizations, students, PhD students working on dissertations and things that will be impacted by this. And so I just wanted to very quickly encourage those in the audience who could use that sort of support, who could also offer support to others, to follow up with the coalition and let us know about your needs, because we're here to help with that. Okay, so after that quick plug, let me transition back now to the main reason that I was asked to talk with you all today, and that's thinking about the sorts of research-led solutions that have been put out there. And the real challenge in this area of work is that we find across many different studies at this point that while it's relatively straightforward, it's actually not that difficult at all to change people's attitudes. we can really only change those attitudes for short periods of time. And it's much, much more difficult to change people's behaviors. So for example, if we intervene, if we develop interventions with people to change their ideas, let's say their anti-Semitic ideas, we can reduce their feelings of and expressions of anti-Semitism for relatively short periods of time, but changing their long-term attitudes and certainly changing their behaviors can be much, much more difficult. We have had some success, and there are a couple of studies that I'm going to tell you about that I've been working on with my colleagues in introducing interventions that really focus on creating a sense of deep personal connection between those who hold extremist views and those who are in the sorts of marginalized communities that they may hold those views against. So for example, a study that my colleague Ethan Porter at George Washington University at GW has led that involved myself and a number of other researchers found that if we presented in an online environment, if we presented a video of someone sharing their personal story as well as their family's personal story of experiences with anti-Semitism, we actually reduced the number of visits to anti-Semitic websites among those who had been visiting those websites quite frequently before our intervention. So we do think that there's some promise with that. And in fact, we're extending the work now because there's a body of literature that says that these deep sort of personal interactions can be even more affected or even more effective if they actually include an element of humor. And so led by my colleagues, Katie Baylord and Andrew Thompson, both at GW as well, we're working on a project that's supported by ADL that examines whether these humorous interventions might have even stronger behavioral impacts. Again, led by my colleague, Katie Baylord, I'm involved in another project that has been looking at the relationship between online extremist conversations, discussions in places like Telegram, and the offline behaviors that these extremist organizations undertake. And what we found is this very, very interesting pattern that suggests that there may be opportunity for creative interventions at certain moments. So what we found is that in these sort of discussion forums that are organized by different extremist organizations, that in periods when they've spent a lot of time really identifying and focusing on their grievances, diagnosing problems that they see with society and the way that they're being treated, expressing injustices and so on, that those periods of really concentrated focus on those grievances are then correlated very shortly thereafter with offline nonviolent protest activities. Following those nonviolent offline protest activities, we then see a corresponding uptick in what we refer to as motivational frames or motivational communication, which is really at its heart about solidarity building among those groups. So they go from identifying these grievances, take offline nonviolent action, and then come back from that offline nonviolent action and begin pumping themselves up, right? Talking about how great they are as a group, how they feel solidarity amongst themselves. And that in turn then correlates with offline violent activities. And so though we haven't tested any particular interventions just yet, this study that I've just described to you is currently under review, under peer review. So we haven't had an opportunity yet to test any interventions, but we think that this research is likely to point to particular moments in which it will be most effective to create some of the interventions that I was talking about even before that. But the last body of work that I want to tell you about briefly is actually focused less on trying to undermine, prevent, address the extremists and changing their attitudes and behaviors, and is actually focused much more on supporting those who are targets of the exact type of abuse and harassment that Jordan and Stevie were highlighting just a few minutes ago. I'm actually leading a project that's supported by the National Science Foundation, co-leading it along with my colleague Kathleen Searles at Louisiana State University, that looks at the best ways to support those who are targets of online abuse and harassment, but particularly focuses on those types of experts who are really at the front lines. So journalists, scientists, civil society researchers who are at the front lines of uncovering and then informing the public about precisely these activities, and then in turn face incredible amounts of abuse and harassment as a result. And so what we have found in our work to date, and what we're doing in response, is building a rapid response system of care that experts who are facing this sort of harassment can actually turn to in moments of crisis. And there are a few key things from our research and the applied elements that I want to share with you, right, as we've been building this up. First and foremost, we are really emphasizing that this has to be an institutional responsibility, that to date, most sorts of projects to address online abuse and harassment have really treated this as an individual level responsibility. And certainly the institutions themselves where these experts are embedded view it as an individual responsibility. We actually see this work, again, because we're focused on the experts who are being targeted. We see this as an occupational hazard. And we're really encouraging everyone that we talk to sort of use that framing going forward, because if we can get people to understand that it's the work itself that is putting these folks at risk, we think that we have much more likelihood of sort of big picture shifts in thinking about exactly how to address this problem. The second point that I'll share from this work is that we think that it's going to be incredibly important moving forward to dedicate the actual resources needed to prioritize human intervention in these moments of crisis. Again, a lot of work in this space, which has been really, really excellent to date, has focused on providing lots of information. Think of informational pamphlets and booklets. Unfortunately, when someone's in the moment of crisis, that's too much, right, for them to absorb and know how to react to. Second, there's been a lot of focus on sort of flashy, technical, simple solutions because they should be relatively cheap and straightforward to introduce. But unfortunately, right, what we know is that people need other people in their moments of crisis. And so the system that we're developing will actually involve dedicated case managers who will respond to this. But that's, of course, resource intensive. And so going back to, right, the argument about the need for viewing this as an institutional responsibility, we really believe that the institutions themselves are going to need to invest in providing this sort of support. And the third and final point that I'll make before turning it over to the last of our colleagues today is to say that we really need to be thinking about this problem as a large-scale capacity building issue. And one of the challenges that we've encountered when we've been talking to, whether it's journalists or other experts who are facing online abuse and harassment campaigns, is that they really want to reach out to those who they love and love them. But the challenge is that those who they love and love them don't fundamentally understand what it is they're going through. And so while in the midst of crisis, while being targeted, the targets spend a lot of time having to explain to their loved ones exactly what the problem is. And that, unfortunately, is itself further traumatizing. So as part of our system, we're developing a number of what we call community care materials. In fact, our case managers will work directly with the target's loved ones to take on that burden and help them understand what it is they're going through and the most productive ways to help. This will also involve support from bystanders as well, but we think that we need a much larger sort of societal-wide expansion of understanding about what this problem is if we're going to have, any hopes of long-term success, and that ultimately is best started with those who are closest to and ultimately really do want to do good and support those who are facing abuse and harassment, but just don't have the tools to first and foremost even understand what the problem is, let alone come up with the appropriate interventions to support those that they love. So with that, I will turn things over to our colleague, Michael.
Thank you, Rebecca. Sound check. Can I make sure folks hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Trying to share my screen. Just a moment, please. Can I get a confirmation that you can see my screen?
Yes, indeed. We've got it.
Fantastic. I know that at the beginning of the presentation today, we said speakers would go 5 to 12 minutes. And if I go 12 minutes, that would take us to the end of time. So to Maureen's point in the chat, many of you have asked questions and we'll be circulating the answers to those questions afterwards. Okay, very good. My name is Michael Brown. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security's Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here today. There's been a lot of talk about existing threats nationally, locally, and I'm here to tell you what some of the efforts are taking place from the federal government perspective. Many of you may have not have heard of the Department of Homeland Security Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. And what we are is a collection of folks who provide educational, technical, and financial support to help community efforts to address violence prevention. Specifically, our focus is on targeted violence and terrorism prevention, certainly with our mandate coming out of the Department of Homeland Security. It was just terrorism, and we had expanded that to targeted violence, and I'll get into that shortly on what that is as well. Our center, just to be clear, is not investigators, law enforcement, intelligence officers. I am none of the above. If you look at the slide that's listed right here, we have 5 columns to delineate where we work and where we don't work. We're in this effort of prevention to address things really far upstream to make sure that the items of fear and concern that we've heard about today don't materialize into society. So from a prevention perspective, we're talking about partnership building and trust building. We're talking about increasing awareness, and that includes awareness of the threats, but also awareness of risk factors and protective factors. I know we have a bunch of folks from the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine today, and the focus on social sciences, social work, clinical work plays a very important role. So folks know where to get help and resources instead of pursuing a path throughout the criminal justice system, which I'll get into a little bit more as well. We just heard Rebekah talk about the need for intervention and support and case management. That's a big part of the prevention space too. And then certainly if somebody goes through the law enforcement system or the criminal justice system, when they leave prison at some point, we want to make sure that they have a healthy reentry into society. That's a tough word for me today, society. And we want to make sure that they are contributing positive pro-social members of society. So prevention continues even after the criminal justice system may touch somebody. So just for level setting right here, I know we have a diverse audience of folks with different backgrounds. When we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about violence committed in the name of an ideology to further a political or social agenda. Ideology is allowed in the United States. The violence is not. So specifically, the US government has defined a certain number of categories, which you can see here on the slide. Homegrown violent extremists being folks from abroad who get their inspiration from overseas to carry out a violent act. And then the remaining categories that are listed there, including racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, anti-government, anti-authority violent extremism, animal rights and environmental rights violent extremism, and abortion-related violent extremism. Each of these are considered categories of domestic violent extremists, or otherwise known as DV. Targeted violence, though, does not have that ideological component that we spend so much time talking about. What was the motivation behind somebody's attack? Targeted violence refers to an intentional act against a pre-identified target that may have some ideology, but it's not a requirement necessarily, but it's intended to intimidate or coerce or generate publicity about a grievance. All acts of terrorism are acts of targeted violence, but all acts of targeted violence are not necessarily acts of terrorism. I'm not a lawyer, but this is the simplistic way of kind of clarifying. Sadly, here in California, we've experienced targeted violence and terrorism in a variety of different incidents and attacks that has been very trying on us as a nation, as we've seen attacks in Poway, Gilroy, recently in Monterey Park, Half Moon Bay as well. Some of these acts have been considered terrorism. Some have been considered acts of targeted violence. The consistent thing about them is that, the question always comes back: what could we have done to prevent these incidents from taking place? And as I said, ideology is sometimes the justification narrative for carrying out an attack. But usually, folks are going through individual events, whether it's relationship issues, financial issues, housing issues, and some real upstream issues that you at UCI and the social sciences community can play a part. When you speak to a Homeland Security official, you might, have some perceptions of what that means. But as I said at the very beginning, this is more than a law enforcement matter, so it requires a whole of society approach. Prevention itself is a very locally led process to take place. So we in the Department of Homeland Security Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships are doing our best to identify existing programs and to amplify those programs and to provide the support where we can. When I talk about providing the support, I'll jump ahead a couple of slides right here. We support prevention through three main ways: through educational, technical, and financial support. Educational support is really a training component. We talk about training folks about risk factors and protective factors, terms that social scientists should be and are quite familiar with. But we also talk about protective factors and the types of social service programs that exist in the communities and how we stitch those together to provide whole of care service for individuals. The federal government is not necessarily doing the intervention at all. In fact, we prefer at the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships that community-driven networks are the ones that are going to be able to provide the services and help for those who need it. When we talk about technical support, we talk about policy support. There was a question in the chat that came up about, what can be done from a policy perspective. One of the things that CP3 is doing is we're starting to work with state governments to advance the development of targeted violence prevention strategies. In fact, the states of Illinois and Hawaii have published strategies just in the past year, and we're trying to generate support to elevate this as a priority, targeted violence prevention, no matter what. And then financial support. Financial support comes through our grants program, which I'll come back to and present on in just a moment. But before I do, I want to talk about our public health, not our, but a public health model to address targeted violence and terrorism prevention. When we think about how we address violence prevention, oftentimes the one topic that comes up is the criminal justice system and concerns and, trust of working with law enforcement, which we're all very attuned to here in Southern California and even here in Orange County. A public health model to address targeted violence and terrorism prevention can really be addressed through primordial, primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. And if you're a practitioner in this space, this isn't too technical of a conversation, but if you're new to this space, just starting from the bottom of the pyramid right there, you can see primordial prevention. The reason why it's on the bottom of a pyramid, because it's addressing policy to prevent risk factors from even occurring. And by risk factors, we could be talking about things that anybody experiences. It could be social isolation. It could be difficulty with one's parents. It could be housing problems, educational deprivation, These policy issues that prevent that can be addressed through the prevention of risk factors can be very, very helpful to support broader prevention efforts before violence is even entering one's picture. Primary prevention is really about getting bystander support out there, which we heard Rebekah just mention a little while ago. It's also the types of community programs that maybe some of you are members of, a Boys and Girls Club, for example, a religious institutions, social service programs. These help build protective factors to support prevention, again, before violence is even a factor. When violence is becoming a concern, we then get into intervention. If you move up the pyramid into secondary prevention, these are trained professionals who do threat assessments to identify if somebody is on that process of radicalization to violence. And these folks, under a public health model, should be referred to appropriate services to deter violence. And I don't mean through law enforcement services. There might be specific intervention programs that are available that can be provided as far as aftercare after somebody's identified as somebody who needs help. For example, a child in a school. What is the treatment plan to make sure that they continue to contribute in a positive way and don't present an issue of concern to those in the surrounding community? And then tertiary prevention is the type of prevention for somebody who has already done something bad, carried out an act, who has almost carried out an act, who has returned from prison. These are folks that we want to make sure that they are contributing in a healthy way to society, and that's where the prevention mission continues. I know I went through this a little bit quickly, but I just want to make sure that folks understand that this health-informed approach is an alternative to criminal justice solutions, and it's something that all of us, especially those at UCI Dr. Maurer, School of Sociology, School of Social Work,
Social Sciences,
Social Sciences, especially your students and your fellow faculty can play a part in contributing to as well. Going through really quickly right here, just trying to keep an eye on the clock. We do have our grant program right now. There's a link on the bottom. I did drop it in the chat as well. DHS.gov/TVTP grants. That stands for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. We have a current grant guidance that's online at this moment, but the period hasn't opened yet. That's going to open next month in March, and we'll have a notice of funding opportunity come out, and you'll have about 2 months to put together applications if you're interested in applying for a grant to prevent acts of targeted violence and terrorism. And again, that could mean that your work handles proximal outcomes, which ultimately would stop the violence. Some of these grants, for your information, could range to $500,000, but we've also given out grants that are $50,000. And some have been over $1 million as well. It's for 2-year money that could support individuals, organizations applying, and we would start the implementation of the grant this coming fall, and it would run through 2025. I know we're here to talk about the online space right here. I wanted to specifically highlight that if you're addressing online aspects of targeted violence and terrorism and the prevention of it as well, certainly that's one of the grant program's priorities. On our website, we do have some videos and webinars that go into the details and the technicality of the grant, so I won't get into all the specifics. I do want you to know, though, if you're interested in applying, that institutions of higher education are eligible, as are nonprofits, government agencies, tribal organizations, as well as local government agencies too. Project types and funding, there's 8 different categories on there. I won't read through all of them right here with respect to the time that we have, but there are many different categories, and I'm available to refer you or questions to our grants team so we can help you get started on your application. Because I speak to a number of folks for CP3 around the region, I have to maintain neutrality during this period of the open application, but I can definitely get you connected with resources that you need. We have funded 9 grantees in California just since 2020 alone. For you to see, we funded a museum, we funded content development, we funded the DA's office on a restorative justice model, we funded an art organization, a police department, a university, as well as a local tribe in 29 Palms. So I want you to be aware that, you know, there's a lot of diversity opportunities for unique applications for the grants program. I did want to highlight just the theme of the work that we're doing here today on today's webinar as well. I recognize that many of you may have accounts here, but there's always a talk about, you know, do we need to get rid of the platform or shut the platform down? And I just want to make the point that, these platforms you might see as being very large, but then some of these platforms might not be as large, and maybe you don't recognize all of them. And then some of these platforms are really some of those corners of the internet where really just bad activity is taking place and the manifestation into violence. What we've done in CP3 is we've hosted digital forums to convene community leaders to generate discussion about a topic of relevance to specific sectors in the online space. The tech companies get a lot of heat because of the activities that's taking place. We're trying to highlight tech for good. So when we hold our digital forums, I'll send you the invitation, Dean Maurer, to extend the invitation to your respective audiences as well. And then finally, we also fund a program through Invent to Prevent. You can do a Google search on this unique campaign. It's an experiential approach to leverage curriculum to generate counter narratives to offset some of the negative activity that we're seeing in the online space by generating student campaigns to address targeted violence and terrorism prevention. I served as a judge just last month in Washington, D.C. We've done this at the high school level and we've done this at the university level, essentially to stimulate innovation and get good ideas outside of government, because we all recognize that government, myself included, do not have all the solutions. We have regional prevention coordinators like myself around the country. I'm based in Southern California. We're also supporting the development of statewide strategies. And I look forward to working with folks up in Sacramento to see if we can bring the policy and strategy solution to the space, which I mentioned earlier. There are various components to a statewide strategy. This includes training. It includes the connection with social service programs that many of you are affiliated with, as well as the support for behavioral threat assessment and threat management teams. I'm going through this quite quickly. We have some resources, some papers available online, which we can share with you from our website. And if you ever have any questions or you feel like that we at CP3 should be speaking with you or your respective partners to be able to provide help and support you and find best practices from around the country to support the work that you're doing, please don't hesitate to let us know. If you have one slide to take a copy of, this is probably the one to do a screenshot. Unfortunately, I can't share the slides all at once right now, but my email address, my phone number is there. Very happy to help you out and be supportive, as I'm based here in Orange County myself. Been here in California for 2.5 years from the East Coast in Washington, D.C. Thanks for your time, and over to you, Dean Maurer.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm actually going to kick it back to Maureen to close us out.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. I know that you're trying to rush in the end, but don't worry, we will go ahead and send that out to all the participants. Thank you again for to all our panelists, and thank you again to UCI and for all the support that we have received in terms of doing this very important work. Thank you for joining us, and we will look forward to hearing getting all the information from Fran later. Thank you again. Have a great day.